is not working so well anymore. And probably, as mentioned, you might know somebody who has lost their sense of smell, since it is a pretty common symptom with COVID-19. So let's see. Okay. So this is us, humans, kind of hanging out. But before we had all of our feet and our hands and eyes and ears, this was us. And actually, this is not fully us. We actually don't have eyes. We don't have ears. We're just a floating amoeba that's reactionary and not really probably the smartest of animals. And so this is when the chemical senses was born. So chemical senses, which is being able to detect some chemical in the environment, was one of some of the first senses, because it's a very easy sense to process and to process for behavioral reasons. So for example, in this case, let's say you're an amoeba, you're floating in some pond, and all of a sudden some chemical shows up. Now, in this case, this is actually a chemical, amyl acetate, which smells like bananas. And so banana smell shows up, and you have a quick decision to say, should I approach it or should I avoid it? And that's really what the chemical senses does, including smell. And when I'm talking about chemical senses, I'm talking about taste. You have 5 basic tastes. I'm talking about smells. And I'm also talking about another thing that called chemesthesis, which is the stinging on your tongue or the burning in the back of your nose whenever you drink a soda pop. So smell, to be more precise, and this is what we're going to talk about. We're not going to talk about the other chemical senses, just smell today, is one or more volatilized chemical compound that we perceive by our sense of smell. So most objects have some smell to it. So let's take, for instance, this amyl acetate. So amyl acetate, it's one chemical that we smell, and we perceive it as banana-like. But let's say, what is an actual banana? Well, an actual banana is not just one chemical, but it is a lot of chemicals, probably over 50. And it's probably one of the more simpler smells. While most odors, which is a collection of odorants, or in this case, chemicals like amyl acetate, actually have over 100 or several hundred odorants that come together to form some object. Now, as we evolved, so did our senses, right? So our nose started moving upwards, right, as we started walking on land, and we started using other senses for decision making, such as vision and auditory. And this really led a lot of people to think that smell was no longer important for humans. And research kind of shows that, because no one actually studied it for a very long time. And most of the studying was done just on the perceptual side while ignoring a lot of the biology. But in the 1990s, Richard Axel and Linda Buck discovered the olfactory receptors or genes that in the human genome. And they showed that it's actually 1%, which is a very large amount. And they later got a Nobel Prize for this in 2004. So this really kickstarted a lot of research, definitely on the biology side of smell. Interestingly, out of the 1,000 genes, really around only 400 are active. So only 400 are actually receptors, which is still a lot of receptors if you consider vision, which only has about 4 receptors, right? You have 3 cones and a rod. But actually, this also gave more weight to this idea that we're not good smellers. And that's because if you take a mouse, it has about 1,100 working receptors. And so once again, smell is called a insignificant for humans scent. Now, as we started looking at the biology, we realized how extremely complex smell is. We can do a lot with these 400 receptors. So on the very top here, we have different receptors. And then on the left here, we have different odorants. Each one of these blobs, the bigger the size, the more that a receptor responds to an odorant. So to show you the complexity of what 400 receptors can do and why we could smell well over 10,000 smells with just 400 receptors, you can see on here that one receptor, let's take this one, can actually respond to lots of odorants. And then if you look at it the other way, you can say one odorant can respond to lots of receptors. So if you do the math on that, you can see that there is a very large combination of different ways that we could smell, that our receptors and odorants play along with each other. And then when you consider that there's this response comes on a gradient, the math even gets a little bit even bigger. So the question is, with these 400 receptors, are we bad smellers compared to everybody else? And this is what everybody has thought for a long time. And it is not since till we started looking at the biology that we actually realized that we're actually pretty good smellers. So if you take this chart, this is the amount of neurons in our olfactory bulb, which I'll get to later, but it's an area in the brain that we smell with. We're kind of in the middle of the pack, you know? So these are lots of different animals along the x-axis, and the amount of neurons, the higher the better. You know, we have just same amount as baboons. We have similar amounts to pretty much most animals. Now, looking at this a different way is like, how sensitive can we actually smell? So here on the x-axis, we have different chemicals. So these are chemicals that have different smells, and they actually function. If you remember your chemistry, most chemicals have a carbon backbone, and so this is just an increase in the carbons, and the threshold here on the y-axis is relative to the concentration of the odorant. So typically, when a concentration is higher, you can smell the odorant better, or it has a stronger smell. So the lower the being able to smell it at a lower concentration means you're more sensitive to that odorant. So the bottom part of this, it means you're a more sensitive smeller. Now here we have a whole bunch of different animals, including dogs, which typically people get compared to dogs. And what you can see is it kind of depends on the odorant, where we're the box, and we're actually the best smellers for a couple of odorants. And sometimes we're in the middle of the pack, but we're very rarely the worst. So actually, humans are pretty good smellers. We just have adapted to use our smell for different things. So I think we still use it for this kind of original amoeba reason of avoid something, approach something. But the things we avoid and the things we approach are different now. So we might not use our sense of smell too much to avoid a predator. But actually, some cultures still do, because there's still hunter-gatherer cultures in different continents. And they might still use it for this reason. But we might use it still to detect a fire or a gas leak. So for some, we might use it to avoid certain hazards. We also use it to avoid sick people or fearful people. And there's a lot of research showing that we're very good at this. Now, for approaching, we might not use it to track some animal that we want to hunt for food. But we still use it to track for different food, it's just a different way that we do it now. And we also use it for approaching maybe somebody that we find as a possible partner. So there's a huge social component now to smell, as we've evolved to be pretty social creatures. So next, I'm going to just go into kind of the details of how we actually smell. So this right here is kind of just a side cut of our head looking at our sense of smell. So for the most part, I've been talking about this type of smelling, which is external smelling. You know, this is used a lot for approaching, avoiding, for spatial memory of where I am in the world, just like you use for vision when you use signposts and buildings, and social communication. And how this smell works is external odorants. So let's consider these little dots. Odorants travel up the nose. And then at the very top of the nose is actually a sensory organ that has little neurons that attach to the odorant and then send a signal up through a small perforated bone into what is called the olfactory bulb. So that was what I was talking about with neural density earlier. From there, it travels along a track on the outside. It's part of the brain, but it kind of looks like it's on the outside of the brain. And then it goes into the brain, into a primary olfactory cortex. And then it talks to lots of other different areas to come up with the image of amyl acetate is banana. Now, the other way you can smell is internally or retronasal. So this is usually what we would call flavor perception. So smell probably makes up around 75% of flavor, and we'll talk about that in a minute. It also helps with appetite control and also detecting nutrition in food. And how this works is it goes in the throat, up the back of the throat where there's an opening, and then it hits the sensory neuron. So there's two different pathways and they're very different. And this leads to smell being one of the only senses that is actually a dual sense, where two different routes can actually present the same chemical differently to the brain. Now, if you stopped by the library and picked up your jelly bean pack, we're going to go ahead and just play around with that, because jelly beans are a great way of noticing these two different routes, but also you can see the contribution that smell has on flavor. So if you go up and open up your pack, I actually forgot my pack, so I'm just using a cookie. So if you're just trying to grab something in your house also, anything works here. And what you're going to do is you're going to grab one of the jelly beans, plug your nose, put this inside of it, keep holding your nose, and I want you to try to detect what is the flavor of the jelly bean. You're probably not going to be able to, but because you're probably just getting sweet and sour. Now, let go of your nose. Well, now you can figure out maybe it's strawberry, maybe it's lemon, maybe it's orange. So you can now see that all the nuances of eating really does come from smell. And the odorants have to have airflow to be able to get all the way up to that sensory organ. Now there is, with this revival of the biology of smell and smell, people realizing how important it is, there's a whole bunch of new avenues that are being explored. And I'll just quickly talk about what the lab that I've joined here at Monell, what we're really concentrating on. We're concentrating on digitizing smell. So right now, if you saw these jelly beans on a TV, you could look at its color. You could look at you could hear it if the crinkling of the package, but you can't smell it. So you get the appearance, you get the action, but you don't get the full scenery because you're missing a sense. And you can't smell it because we can't digitize smell right now. So unlike color vision, which we know the space, which is RGB, you might have heard, where on 3 different dimensions, we actually can create most colors. We don't know what kind of dimensions there are of smells to be able to create them. And that's something that our lab is currently trying to do. Now we've talked about a functional smell system. Let's go into what happens when you lose your sense of smell. So there's multiple ways you can lose your sense of smell. One is a peripheral way. So that is that sensory organ I was talking about. Something happens to it, or something happens around it. So you can have conductive loss. Probably most people have had this when you've had a cold and you get congestion with in your nose or in your sinuses. And what this does is it kind of blocks the passage of air, and without air, there is no smelling. You can also get damage to the nose. So this is neuronal damage. So that sensory organ, it itself gets damaged either through a virus, through inflammation, or actually direct damage from maybe trauma to the face. Now, and I recommend that watch this video if you want more information. I'll share my slides later. Now, I'm glad that we all ate our jelly beans, because this is going to be a little gross, but this is actually going to be, you know, if you've ever had an endoscope where you go to the doctor and they stick that big giant camera up your nose. This is the inside of someone's nose, where we're going to start from the outside and then we're going to move inwards to the different parts of it. So here, this is going up the left side of the nose. So the septum is always going to be flat. And then you have all of these turbinates or notches within the nose, which creates turbulence of the air, which actually helps get more air into the nose, but it also helps makes it kind of difficult for pathogen stuff to make it up to the sensory neurons. So this is why we only smell around 10 to 15% of all things that we breathe in, because it's quite of a long passage. So you can also, we talked about peripheral damage, but you can also have central damage. So here is a little bit closer look at this sensory neurons that come through this kind of perforated bone and connect to this olfactory bulb. And here on the right side, you could see this olfactory bulb. You could see it kind of sits outside the brain, but is actually part of it, and then follows this track down into the more bulky part of the brain that we know about. So imagine if you got in a car crash or you just hit your head really hard. Well, this is just sitting right here. And what happens is it will sever all the sensory neurons. And then you have to wait until they grow back. So the good thing about smell is it's one of the few senses that has lots of regeneration. So typically it takes about a month or two for these sensory neurons to regenerate, even if they're completely dead. But sometimes they don't regenerate, or they regenerate incorrectly, which leads to smell impairments. So talking about some of these smell impairments, we have several different categories. So the most well-known and studied ones is anosmia and hyposmia. Both of these are smell loss through a change in strength. So anosmia is a complete loss of smell. You can't smell anything at all. There's no intensity if you smelt your coffee very closely. Hyposmia, meaning you have partial loss, meaning your sense of smell of that coffee is a lot weaker than compared to other people. But you also have these more qualitative disorders like Prosmia and Phantasmia. Here you have smell distortion, and you might have heard about this with COVID because it's happening with a lot of people. And with Prosmia, it means if I smell this cup of coffee, it doesn't smell like coffee. It smells like something completely different, usually a negative thing. Phantasmia means I'm washing my clothes and I smell coffee and I'm nowhere near it. It's an hallucination of the smell. Now, I was messaged because of this article, and I do recommend that anybody who is more interested in some of the details I'm talking about to go read it, because it's a very well-written article actually from somebody who can't smell. And in this, it talks about COVID-19 and smell loss. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that because it's pretty relevant to today. So all of a sudden, there was a boom in smell loss studies starting in probably March, April. And a lot of us who work on smell were getting calls and just seeing a huge amount more of the literature come out. You can see right here, these are just the number of studies by country, and there's quite a bit. And what we were hearing is around 5 to 95% of COVID-19 plus patients were losing their sense of smell, and it was very sudden. So due to this and due to researchers informing governments that this seems to be very prevalent, much more than is typically happening with other viruses, the CDC and other government agencies like the World Health Organization decided to actually add this as a major symptom. So keep in mind the three main symptoms are fever, chills, cough, shortness of breath. So we're going to talk about that in just a little bit. So actually, smell, in comparison to the CDC and some work that we did, actually is a way better predictor of COVID-19 by quite a bit. And you can see that when you take the hundreds and thousands of cases, you actually see that there's more people with smell loss than these other more symptoms that were on the original list. Now, I told you that people had lost between 5 and 95%, right? And the reason is that because there's all different types of way to test the sense of smell. You've got subjective and you've got objective measures. So subjective is what probably most clinics do if they're not specialized in smell or taste. Here, you maybe fill out a survey and you say, yes, I've lost my smell. No, I haven't. Or maybe you get a phone, you report that you've lost your sense of smell through the phone. While objective tests actually use special types of validated smell tests to actually put you into a category of smell loss. So here we have the sniff and sticks, which is a very popular one. That's from out of Germany. Here we have a smaller version of the upsit, which is here at Penn. And this is actually a Japanese test. So whenever you actually look at the sense of smell objectively, what you see is a very large increase in the amount of people with smell loss. You see about 20 to 30 times more people, because it's just a much more sensitive way to actually look if someone has lost their smell. So from the idea that smell predicts really well, it's very sensitive, and you want something very objective, that kind of led us here at Monell to kind of talk about developing a rapid smell test called Sentinel to be used during the COVID-19 period. So those clinical objective tests, one issue with them is they're made for clinics and they take quite a bit of time to actually fill out. So what we want to do is make a very rapid test that could be used pretty much anywhere, maybe as a way of screening people from coming into a building or a restaurant. And so things that we considered is it needs to be fast, no special tools to like scratch it, and be no leftover odors and be adaptable. And for scientific reasons, we need it. There's multiple types, multiple functionalities of olfaction, so we want to test them all. We want to be really accurate, multiple different odors, so people don't get bored and they can do the test more often. And of course, we want to validate it with a patient population, make sure it's actually being able to distinguish between a healthy person and somebody with smell loss. So this is the test that we actually came out with. And if you also picked up your packet, you should have one of these. And so we're going to go ahead and just go through it real quick. So a little closer, if you go ahead and actually, if you have this with you, you can actually scan this, or you can do it after this is done. You can actually scan this and you can do this online through a website. But what you're going to do is it's measuring 3 different things. Detection. So this is kind of that threshold or ability to detect some kind of concentration. You have intensity. So this is how strong is the odor, and then identification. Can you actually identify it? So there is multiple different odorants across the packets. So if everybody will go ahead and just go through each one. So I'm going to open up A first. Smell it. I'm going to open up B. Smell it. I'm going to open up C. And now I'm trying to decide which one is it? Is it A, B, or C that has the odorant? For me, I think it's A. Next, I would be rating it on the intensity. So maybe I'll go smell it again to kind of rate intensity. It's pretty strong. Maybe I'll give it a 70 out of 100, 100 being the strongest. Now the question is, what does it smell like? And we can actually just use the chat for this if people want to just like type in there what they think it smells like. Any guesses? Just put in the chat and we'll go through it. It's kind of hard if you don't have the app up. This is a very difficult task to freely name odors. Mint, rose-like, floral. Anybody else? Well, I could tell you rose, floral. Okay, you guys are on to something. So actually, this is a very difficult task in the sense that there is usually, and you'll see if you actually scan this in, we give a multiple choice question for this. So we're not, I didn't get into this, but we're not good at actually identifying odors without some kind of, putting us in some kind of range or something to compare it to. So in this case, I think mine kind of smells like coffee. And maybe other items that would be in the multiple choice would be maybe rose, maybe mint, maybe popcorn. These are all things that once I can look at all 4, I know that it's probably coffee. But the multiple choice that once you fill out this, do it on the thing after the call, you'll see that. So we did go ahead and run a study and tested this out to see how well it works, and it works really good. And what's really interesting, so these are kind of scientific plots, but you want it to be able to detect people and be right, and you want it to not be wrong that often. So you really want it up here in this corner is kind of where you want this thing. And what you can see here is we have the overall score and we have all these sub tests that I talked about. And it's the overall, so you need all the tests to actually be really able to detect. And we can detect with very high accuracy with this test. So lastly, I'd like to let people know that if they're interested in smell, there's a lot of interesting work happening with this global consortium of chemosensory research. So this is actually something that has formed during COVID, and probably because of COVID, And I feel like there's going to be a lot of great research that's going to come out of just a lot of researchers coming together to try to answer some of these many unanswered questions of smell. If you know someone who has lost smell, or you have lost smell yourself, or having some kind of issues, I recommend checking out this Absent, which is a charity of the UK. There's also a new one that we here in the US that I also recommend looking up. And there's a lot of good material on both of them. And then the other people who worked on this Sentinel project at Monell, these are all of them. And you know, if you have any questions, feel free to email me or message me on Twitter. But is there any questions?
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
I don't have a loss of smell. I have actually, how did the one guy describe it? Because I did get it checked and they didn't seem to be able to find a problem, but it happened probably a couple of years ago. I think I was at a restaurant and I don't know if it was something I ate or what, but I just, after several months after, a lot of things had like a rancid grease smell. And it just seemed like it just knocked my senses way out of whack. And the doctor had explained it that your smell senses, basically it's a nerve, and maybe something just reset your nerve, and it's you know, so it's almost like a memory type thing that maybe just certain things just kind of set that off. So I don't know, but I'm trying to kind of deal with it, because a lot of times I walk into somewhere, I'm just thinking, man, something doesn't smell right in here. It's the food or whatever, but it's like a I don't know if it's hypersensitive or whatever, but a lot of smells just smell bad to me. I don't know what the problem is.
No, yeah, I mean, it kind of sounds like Prosmia, which is that distortion of smell I was talking about. So typically with Prosmia, it happens whenever you've had some kind of damage, and maybe you had some damage that you're unaware of too. And during the regeneration process, maybe things just hook up wrong. So do you feel like it has gotten better over time, or has it got worse over time?
I think it's somewhat better. It's just that every so often something just sets it off, and I could walk into somewhere and I just tell my wife, I said, "Do you smell that?" And she's like, "I don't know what you're talking about." So, but are you down in Philadelphia as where you're?
Yeah.
The one doctor suggested maybe go down to the institute and get some additional testing done, which I just haven't found the time for, or, you know, I was just kind of dealing with it. To me, I almost look at it, well, maybe it's a blessing in disguise, because it kind of stops me from eating certain things sometimes that I normally eat. So I don't know. It kind of comes and goes. It's strange, very strange.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I definitely, you know, it's always good to kind of get to a specialist about something like that. But sometimes with those distorted smells, it is kind of learning to reassociate things, because, you know, I didn't mention this, but there is actually no treatment for the loss of smell.
Right.
Some things seem to work better, like sometimes maybe a topical steroid sometimes works, which would be something your doctor would prescribe, or, you know, blockage, like let's say, so sometimes, you know, that video we watched where you go up the nose and we follow that, sometimes you have blockage in there that
I had
polyps and stuff that get removal will all of a sudden bring back the sense of smell. But you can also do, there's alternative treatments that seem to have some kind of impact, although it's still kind of not understood fully, like olfactory training, which is a very easy thing you can do. And I would say that Absent website has a very great guide on how to do that. So I would look at that.
Okay.
There are several additional questions in the chat. Is there a way to, or you touched on this a little bit, maybe, is there a way to restore or improve the sense of smell?
Yeah, I mean, so It's depending. So if you have some dysfunction, I recommend seeing an ENT specialist because it's different for all different types of cases. Sometimes it's an easy, quick fix, such as removing polyps, but other times it's a little bit more complex. But I would say even for both a dysfunctional and a healthy sense of smell, we do see improvements with this olfactory training. So in both groups. And olfactory training is basically you get 4 different odorants, but it could probably work with most odorants, just something really strong in concentration, like an essential oil. And you sniff it twice a day. So you're just sniffing very strong concentrations of odorants. And think of it kind of like lifting weights. It's like working out your sense of smell.
Is there anything that's related to tinnitus? Because I've been having problems with ringing in my ears, and I don't know if that's interconnected because it seemed like a lot of it was starting to happen at the same time. So
so there might be something. So you have in the back of your throat, you have the eustachian tube, which is actually a tube that connects from the back of your throat to the middle of your ear. And that's actually when you hold your nose and go like this, when you're in a plane to relieve pressure, you're actually relieving pressure there. And so there is a connection between the two. And so there could be something involved with that. So I would definitely meet up with a specialist, mention both of those issues.
Yeah, well, I said that the specialists that I had gone to in the area were the ones that were recommending just if I wanted to go further to check down at the hospital down there in Philly or the smell center, whatever it is there. But
yeah, so yeah, Penn and Drexel both have some really great ENT doctors.
Right.
So a similar question, is there research going on specifically on Phantasmia?
Yeah, there's quite a bit of people. I mean, I think there's more focus right now on Prosmia, but both of them are getting looked at a lot more because of COVID mostly. But there's a lot of interesting work. I'm doing a lot of work in this area. We recently collected around 2,000 different smell loss patients and looked at distinct features of Prosmia and Phantasmia. And we see they are very separate because they used to just get lumped together. But there's a lot more work, and it's a kind of, I would say, the quality dysfunctions are the least known about.
Another interesting question. Are there people who are super smellers, meaning they have an unusually good sense of smell? And can you train yourself to smell better?
Yeah, so I would definitely say there's a large variation of smellers. Some people tend to be able to smell certain odorants at very low concentrations compared to other people. A general increase in smell is also seen with people who maybe just spend more attention to odors. So yeah, there's definitely differences across people. And one way to get better at smelling is to really give it more attention, So like I said, olfactory training is a great way to do that. Also, just like when you eat something, don't just, chew it, swallow and forget about it, but, savor it.
Someone says, could you reiterate the distinction between Prosmia and Phantasmia?
Yeah. So Prosmia is it's a distortion from some object, right? So it's a distortion of an odor with a source. So I used a cup of coffee earlier. So let's say I have the cup of coffee right in front of me and I smell it and it smells like garbage or it smells completely different than a cup of coffee. While phantom smells or Phantasmia is dealing with basically you just have the smell of coffee when there's no coffee around. So it's a odor hallucination or a smell without any source.
Is it true that people with hay fever were very good smellers or are very good smellers? If you want
Oh,
to.
I don't know. What is a, yeah, I have no idea about that.
Is there something like an odor bank in the brain that links smell and memory or emotion?
Yeah. So I kind of just briefly touched on how smell is routed up to the brain. And interestingly, it is routed very differently than all the other senses. This is probably because it's probably like the oldest sense. And so it takes a different pathway, and it actually directly connects with the memory and the emotional parts of the brain, like the amygdala and part of the hippocampus. So smells and memory are extremely related. And you might have experienced, you smell something and you bring back to your childhood. The smell memories are associations that are made pre-teens. So before you make usually memories with other senses, you are already made odor memory associations. And that's why you always brought back to your childhood. And they're very vivid.
Yeah, I think most of us like maybe just the smell of Crayola crayons.
Yeah.
It's just an instant, right back in grade school. Somebody asked, do the majority of people who lose their sense of smell and taste from COVID regain it?
Yes. So typically people regain it actually way quicker than, so like I said, smell loss has been around for a long time. People lose their senses of smell to other viruses. But actually with COVID, I would say it looks like about 90% of people will kind of recover within a couple months. So it kind of depends. There's kind of a couple different groups. There is a large amount of people that recover within a week or 2 weeks. So that means that they didn't have any neuronal damage. But if the virus spread or there was some inflammation, then there might have been some damage to that sensory organ at the top of the nose. And then you have to go through the process of regeneration. And usually it takes a couple months. So, but it looks like there are some long haulers, is what they're calling them, for other symptoms, but also the sense of smell, where they have the symptoms persist past 6 months.
Somebody just wanted to point out that the US group that you mentioned is STANA, I think that.
Yeah, STANA.
And they have a website, very simply, thestana.org. So if anybody wants to look into that. Don't see any more questions. I would definitely also recommend, if you're interested in the work that's being done at Monell, that you look at the website. Their annual report is actually an amazingly it's just a great example of science communication, where they really explain in layman's terms what they're doing, and it's absolutely fascinating. It's the most readable annual report I've ever come across. So that's available to see at the Monell, and we can provide these links in a follow-up email as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of great work happening at Monell. Yeah, so Monell is actually an institute that just concentrates on the chemical senses. So it's pretty unique.
All right. So again, if you have further follow-up questions, you can reach out to Dr. Pellegrino. We've got his email here, and again, I'll share that with you in a follow-up. If there are no more questions, I'd just really like to thank you, Bob. This was fascinating, and I think it's encouraging to us to see that this research is being done. And I think we're all going to be kind of following it with more insight and more interest from now on.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks everybody for being here. So take care. Happy smelling.
Happy smelling.
All right.